would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend them.
Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric, from the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all. Join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. If you enjoy the show and find it of value, consider supporting and becoming a patron via the Patreon at patreon.com/philosophicalminds. A small contribution makes a big difference and definitely makes it easier for me to continue the show, although I will always do my best to keep it flowing regardless. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right, tonight I am here with Jaime Paul Lamb, a musician, author, certified Hellenistic astrologer, frater of the Arizona College of Societas Rosicruciana in Civitatibus Feoderatus? How do you...
Very admirable effort there. So since it's Latin, some people do the hard C's where you would say Societas Rosicruciana in Civitatibus Federatus. But most people say Societas Rosicruciana in Civitatibus Federatus, or just SRICF.
All right, and then as well as the Hermetic Society of the Golden Dawn and Worshipful Master of Ascension Lodge 89 here in Arizona. So a many-layered onion and a well-read individual. You're definitely a wealth of, or a gold mine of information. I would consider you somewhat of a comparative cosmologist as well. But yeah, anyway, I've been definitely looking forward to this, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Sky. It's a pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure meeting you the other night, and it's we talked about this with TJ Bell and stuff, so stoked to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, that was cool. I actually got to meet you in the real, since you're down here in Arizona. And before we get into it, I wanted to give a huge shout out to your podcast that you do with a couple other guys, the Tria Prima podcast. Do you want to tell people a little bit about that?
Sure. So Tria Prima, we intermittently put out episodes. I believe we have something like 10 of them out right now. We've been doing it a couple years, and it's called Tria Prima because of the three philosophical principles, the Paracelsian principles of salt, sulfur, and mercury. And we keep it to the three of us because we each kind of found that archetypally, at least, we fulfill that kind of those components, in conversation. And it was just a happy accident that it worked out in that sort of, I guess you could say, conversational alchemy, where those three principles are separate, right, but then they're combined in this sort of tincture, I guess, that is a conversation.
Yeah, it's a beautiful dynamic that you guys have. It's awesome. I've listened to 9 episodes. I don't know if you have 9 or 10, but the ones that you've published so far, I listened to all of them. It's definitely a great informative podcast for anybody.
Then you've listened to more than I've listened to, then, because I've never gone back and listened to one of them. Well, that's not true. I might have listened to 1 or 2.
Yeah. So, as a Mason, you're what's called a worshipful master. What exactly is a worshipful master?
Well, the worshipful master, despite the name, is the most service-oriented position in the Blue Lodge, what we call Blue Lodge, or the Philosophical Lodge, Freemasonry, right? The regular craft lodge, 3 degrees, that sort of thing. So the worshipful master is basically, well, here's a way they describe it in the ritual, and I'm not spilling any beans by saying this, but they say they talk about the three lesser lights, which signify the sun, the moon, and the master of the lodge. So you being someone who's interested in alchemy and probably an operative alchemist, and consequently a speculative as well, because I think those things go together, or else it's merely chemistry, right? But so you being an alchemist can probably see what's going on there. If they talk about the sun, the moon, and the master of the lodge in this triplistic kind of scheme, right? The sun and the moon, at least astrologically, being pretty opposite. One is reflective, one is projective, one is active, one is passive, one is masculine, one is feminine, etc. They represent these poles to some extent, even in alchemical symbolism, gold and silver, let's say. But when they say the sun, the moon, and the master of the lodge, talking about the worshipful master of the lodge, they mean that the master must sit at the fulcrum of these two oppositional poles, so the master is sort of the mercurial element who has to like be the universal solvent, I guess. And I'm using more alchemical terminology than I normally would, but because of the nature of your show and stuff. But I think your listeners might appreciate that. So the master is the universal solvent, that mercurial sort of solvent who must sort of balance all oppositions, and mitigate these sort of things. So it's a very service, again, despite the name. You say worshipful master and people think, oh, you're the grand poobah. And yes, you're the one who gets to wear the top hat and stuff, but and you are technically the leader, the guide of the lodge. But in that, there's a lot of responsibility, a ton of memorization, and a lot of like just mitigation, a lot of balancing, and a lot of, kind of making sure everything's smooth, and delegation and things like that. So it's a lot of work, and we don't get paid. It's not like I'm a project manager by trade, commercial lighting project manager. I've been doing that many, many years, but I don't get paid to be a Freemason. So it's not like, I put in all this effort to, go to the lodge. In fact, I pay dues. So it's in the reverse, we pay about $400 a year in my Blue Lodge, which is a lot
Yeah,
comparatively.
I love the way you actually described it like that. That's really cool. And I don't. And with the SRICF, is it the case that it limits its membership to only specifically Christian Master Masons? Is that correct?
It is correct. So you know how in the Blue Lodge they say you must believe in a supreme being. So if you look up the word supreme and the word being, anybody with an imagination should be able to somehow, make that work, whether you're one of the Abrahamic traditions, whether you're Hindu, you're Buddhist, whatever, a supreme being, like for instance, supreme being the most exalted version of something, a being like, it can be a verb, it could be a noun, there's many ways to kind of, and they never ask you to clarify. But in the SRICF, you have to be not only a Christian, you have to be a Trinitarian Christian. So, but they don't ask you a specific denomination. They don't ask you if you are sort of how interpretive you are about that. They don't ask you if you believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who walked on the earth and was nailed to the cross per the Christian creed. They don't ask you that. They don't ask you if you believe in some sort of numinous Christos consciousness that inhabits the Sephirotic, region of Tifereth on the tree of life. You know what I mean? They don't ask you like how literal or how interpretive you are about your Trinitarian Christianity, but you must be a Trinitarian Christian. So that is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost, right? So, which also has alchemical connotations. you know, vis-a-vis that whole like the three philosophical principles, salt, sulfur, and mercury. You could make some arguments for uh, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost being, the mind, body, spirit sort of connection, the salt, sulfur, mercury connection, the pneuma, the soma, and the what's psyche, pneuma, soma, psyche. The
Oh, interesting. Can you elaborate
yeah.
on the I'm not too familiar with that terminology, the noma and or the soma I've heard of, but I'm actually not too sure about what that is and the pneuma.
So um so when you talk about, how in modern, like, let's say post new age circles, they talk about mind, body, and spirit. This is
Yeah.
popular currency in the modern metaphysical milieu since maybe the mid last century. People talk about mind, body, spirit, whatever, and it's a great handy thing, right? But it has precedences going back to ancient times, like say the Latin. The Latin would be spiritus, corpus, and anima. A spiritus is the spirit, corpus is the body, the anima is the soul. So the soul, the spirit, and the body, or the psyche, the spirit, and the body. And then if you go back, so that's Latin. If you go further back, you get the Greek, which is the soma, psyche, and pneuma. The soma is the body, like the corpus. The psyche is the anima, like the soul, or the mind soul kind of axis. And then the pneuma, like breath, like a pneumatic tire, like air. The pneuma is the spirit, spiritus in Latin. So there's this is not a new sort of Trinitarian idea. This goes back to ancient times.
Yeah, definitely. Is the anima related at all to what's referred to as the anima mundi?
Absolutely, because the anima mundi is the soul of the world. The
Okay.
mundi, like mundane, is of or pertaining to the world. The mundi would be the world. The anima would be the soul or the psyche of the world.
Oh. And if I'm
Mhm.
correct, I believe that you attend a Greek Orthodox church, if I recall correctly, in something that I was listening to.
Yes.
I was wondering if you ever get into conversations with your community there about kind of your esoteric explorations or any, affiliations with other esoteric orders, and if so, I'm curious how those conversations typically go. Do they have like a kind of uh, taken back response, or I'm just curious about that.
I don't, I back into my parking space when I, rarely when I go to mass, I back into my parking space so they don't see my Masonic emblems, because from the church's perspective, you cannot be a Freemason and be a member of the Orthodox Churches of America, which includes Greek, Russian, Coptic, Ethiopian, etc. All these Bulgarian probably, and all these other Orthodox churches.
Wow, I didn't
So
realize that.
yeah, there's a big dissonance. So I don't tell anybody. I mean, my wife's family knows. My wife's family is Greek, and we go to their church and stuff. They know, but they also, I think, know not to talk about it too much. So it's like, and there's obviously no persecution from the Masonic side of things. It's not like, uh, if they find out at my Masonic lodge that I'm a Greek Orthodox, that I, was chrismated Greek Orthodox, um, they're not going to kick me out or sweat me at all. They're not. They will have absolutely zero. They'll be like, "Hey, that's cool," or whatever. But at the church, if it falls into the wrong, if that information kind of falls into the wrong hands, and if somebody decides to make noise about it, they can get me excommunicated or something.
Wow. Um, One thing I was hearing you touch on recently was uh, the idea of the archetypal temples, and I thought this was just really cool the way that you describe it. So I was wondering if you could, well, maybe first if you could give your current like active definition of Freemasonry as you see it, just like a maybe a general description, and then maybe you could get into like the practice of temple building as it occurs within masonry and the archetypal temple and all that.
So it sounds like you listened closely. You did a good job listening to stuff. It seems like you understand the gist of what I was doing with that last book. I wrote a book called The Archetypal Temple, was my last one. And I kind of developed this idea. So like you said, Freemasonry, and thereby a Freemason, there's never been there's been a lot of different definitions on what Freemason is, or Freemasonry is, right? Like the most common one is, how's it go? A beautiful system of morality. It's a peculiar system of morality illustrated by symbols and by symbols and allegories, basically what it says. And that's a good definition, right? So this system of morality kind of brought to the initiate through symbols and allegories, I guess, right? So it's great, but it's not a catch-all, and it's not the most sort of reductive definition you could have. So I've been toying around with the idea of Freemasonry is essentially the art and science of speculative temple building, because it's masonry, right? But so I need to talk about that first. Is like, people don't understand, well, people who are not either an operative stonemason or a speculative Freemason probably don't know what the difference is. So the difference is this: an operative stonemason quarries, raises, dresses, fits worked stone in accordance with an architect's plan into like a temple or a church or a cathedral or whatever, a Freemason is different from the operative stonemason, because that's why they call them accepted masons. Free and accepted masons, they were accepted into the craft despite not being operative stonemasons. And this happened, in the late medieval, early modern period. Sometime around then they started accepting speculative Freemasons into the craft. So a Freemason is a speculative temple builder. He doesn't build operative cathedrals and temples, etc. So that means Freemasonry, as opposed to stonemasonry, Freemasonry is the art and science of speculative temple building, and all the things that sort of entails. So I think it's a little more, while it is more specific, it's also somehow more inclusive of what the craft entails, the speculative craft entails, like astronomical orientation, things like that, whatever. Certain bodies of symbolism and certain allegorical mysteries, mystery plays, mystery traditions, etc. So you asked about that, differentiating that, and what I mean by Freemasonry and what we mean by a Freemason. And then from there, so on the premise that a Freemason is a speculative temple builder and Freemasonry is the art and science of speculative temple building, we talk about, if it's not a brick and mortar physical temple, then what precisely are we building as temple builders? And we are building the almost fractal expanse of the temple archetype. And what I mean by this is, well, now we have to define our terms once again, because archetype is a term that's used pretty loosely, pretty freely, and thereby pretty meaninglessly. So we have to define that a little bit. So when I say archetype, I mean it in the sense of for instance, when Carl Jung used the term, he talked about it in terms of the archetype as such, which is more like a Platonic form that exists in sort of the ether. It's not even a physical thing. It's just the sort of ideal form, capital I, capital F, of something, that exists in the abstract sort of plane. It doesn't have a physical manifestation, but it embodies its archetypal images. So you have the archetypal as such at the top, which emanates down through a series of archetypal images. And the archetypal images are concretizations, I guess, or manifestations of that archetypal, of the archetype as such. So a good analogy is like a fork, right? You could have the archetypal fork, right? But on the earth, let's say, you have some forks that are 3-tined, you have some forks that are 2-tined that are long, you have some with a wooden handle, some that are plastic that the ends break off. You'd still call it a fork. There are so many things that qualify as being a fork, right? But they all partake of the archetype of the fork. While they are particulars, they're not a universal, an archetype as such. They're not the universal idea of ultimate forkness. They are physical manifestations of the particular fork that I happen to be using at any given time. So that's what I mean by archetype, and that's what I mean by archetype, the archetype as such, and the archetypal image. It's along the lines of Carl Jung, but it of course goes back to both Plato and Aristotle. So anyway, so the archetypal temple is my idea of that is that the Freemason, the speculative temple builder, again, builds temples on the brick and mortar plane, on the physical plane, but we also build, let's say, a mnemonic temple, a temple of memory, because we have a lot of memory work that we have to do. So we're creating this inner sort of astral memory temple. We're creating an intellectual temple because we work with the 7 liberal arts and sciences in the 2nd degree, which helps us to erect this intellectual temple. There's a lot of moral and ethical teachings in the craft of Freemasonry and in our rituals and things like that regarding the working tools and things. So we're erecting the moral and ethical temple. There's also the celestial temple, that we say that house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So and there are many other degrees from density to rarity, from the densest, most, just physical temple that lodges meet at downtown. But there is also the memory temple, the egregorical temple, to which all Masons sort of project, and create this group egregorical temple. The moral, the ethical, the intellectual, the astral, the cosmic, the celestial, house not made with hands. So you can see that there's this metaphysical ladder, essentially, and that to me is the value of Freemasonry in a nutshell. The value of speculative Freemasonry is that by design, I argue, we're erecting this ladder, this hermetic ladder, by which we go from the densest, most material plane upon which we are all born, and through this sort of almost theurgical process of filling in the fractal spaces till we get to the most rarefied abstract plane of the celestial realm, the angelic, or whatever you care to call that. If you're a Kabbalist, you would call it absolute. If you're Christian, I guess heaven, right? There's if you're Muslim, paradise or something, so there's this. That's what I meant by the archetypal temple, and that's what I mean by my proposition that Freemasons are speculative temple builders.
Wow, I love that. It's such a beautiful description, the way you lay it all out. It's so cool. And
I hope it made sense. I mean, it's a lot to talk about, and it's a very, very complicated idea that I've talked about it a few times, so I feel like I'm able to make it digestible. But is there anything that wasn't clear in that? Because I
felt like it was pretty clear, and it was really cool because I was one of the Tria Prima episodes I was listening to you guys talk about the memory palace and all that, and I thought that was such a cool aspect. And I want to get into that, but I wanted to ask you a other question first before we go into that about, I guess I've always had kind of a hard time for some reason understanding the difference between morality and ethics, are those two different things, and how would you describe them if so? I'm curious from your perspective.
So I think, all right, not my strongest point, but I think that ethics are more like the essentially the syntax of morality. So actions, well, actions can also be ethical.
Because there's
So
like the
wait,
code of ethics. Like somebody would say, I have a code of ethics. And so would that pertain to your code of ethics would pertain to your morality in some sense, or
I think your code of ethics would be would be internal, whereas you you have more morality stories, like the moral of a story that would be the product, the external product. So I tend to think of it, um, and this is only kind of, I'm kind of feeling this out because I've looked these words up before, and it's like, and I've studied them a little in Aristotle. He has his, well, there's his ethics, and there's Plutarch did Moralia. So I've been in and out of those, but it's still like it's iffy. There might be an internal or a micro macro aspect to both of them, you know. Um, but yeah, I think the quick grab, the quick way to say it, I think, is that our ethics are more inward, whereas our morality is something that is sort of extended out into the world.
yeah,
But again, I think that's a pretty loose way of saying that.
yeah. And then would you say that it comes down to basically the idea of right and wrong in terms of something that is moral or immoral?
Well, there you get into a problem called situational ethics, right? So there may be a time where you need to kill a person, and you're somehow justified in that. Like, say if it's self-defense, um, or say if I think that that might even be the only place you would be ethically justified in killing a person. I mean, depending on your moral compass,
Mm-hmm.
and there we go again, because there's a moral compass. We all adopt a moral compass, or have this inner moral compass, while we also have an inner code of ethics. So there's a
And
strange overlap between those two concepts.
and so would you say that the practice of masonry would be assisting and aiding a person in developing a sturdy moral compass in some way, shape, or form?
I would say for sure. And you know how we talk about that most is in terms of the working tools. So like the 24-inch gauge, the common gavel, the plumb, the square, the level, the trowel, all of these operative working tools that operative masons would use. Speculative masonry has a moral and ethical kind of foundation, or rather sort of interpretation of those, right? And we attach moral and see, I always just say moral and ethical just so I'm covering my bases,
Yeah.
because I guess I don't know where they're like a Venn diagram, I think,
Mm-hmm.
where there's a lot of overlap, but then maybe something that differentiates the two. But I just say there are moral and ethical teachings attached to the symbolism, the symbolic use, or the speculative use of these working tools in the craft, and that certainly comes through in our ritual.
Definitely. I think an example you could say like squaring your actions. I think I've heard that said a lot of times, and that's kind of like a Masonic idea in terms of squaring your
Yeah,
actions.
and circumscribing your desires,
Mm,
with the compasses, to
right.
circumscribe our desires with the compasses,
Yeah.
or spreading the cement of brotherly love and affection, which would be with the trowel, or there's a lot of the plumb of rectitude. A plumb is an upright sort of a perpendicular. Um, it tries perpendiculars, right? A plumb, so that it corresponds to moral rectitude, square dealing, like you said. Um, in fact, there's a lot of words we kind of get You ever hear somebody say, "Oh, that's a square deal"?
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
Things like that are. There's some turns of phrase that come from Freemasonry, like 'cause this
Like
guy's a
being on the
square.
level, you'd say.
On the level is one. Blackballed. Somebody gets blackballed from something. That comes from Freemasonry. Somebody gets the third degree. They're giving me the third degree to go through an ordeal. That
Oh,
means.
okay. Yeah. All right. So, yeah. Now I wanna hopefully get you to elaborate a little bit more on the memorization type things and like the memory palace and all of that, because that's all really interesting to me, and I'm somebody, I have kind of a terrible memory. So it's just interesting for me to learn about.
Well, maybe you have a terrible rote memory, but I think doing what you do and being interested in what you're interested in, I'm sure you have an imagination and you have a connection with an inner life, right? And a
Definitely.
connection and a connection with the anima mundi, which also underlies the whole practice of alchemy. You know, in the absence of the anima mundi, there could be no astrology or alchemy or magic, right? Because they would merely become um, astronomy, chemistry, and technology. You know, so the whole thing. Maybe I should say that real quick, is the and I'd have to go back a little bit, and then is that cool? Like,
Oh yeah, definitely. Do go ahead and do whatever.
so so the Enlightenment era. You know about this, the late 17th, early 18th century or thereabouts, right? This early modern sort of Enlightenment era movement that had the Enlightenment, and it had a lot to do with scientific method. It had a lot to do with empirical sort of reductionist science. It had a lot to do with what they would say positivistic, like the sort of secularization of the world, positivism and things like, um, and it basically exorcised, as one would a demon, exorcised the anima mundi out of the sciences and left them, in my opinion, anemic, right? Missing the soul of the sciences, whereas that was relegated strictly to the church, and the sciences were pushed to the side and they've become this mechanistic sort of soulless body of weights and measures, essentially, and trivia. you know the sciences merely become this the universe itself, the cosmos itself, becomes this dead clockwork that we're supposed to measure and observe, right? It's not this interactive, ensouled cosmos anymore. And that happened during the Enlightenment. And that's why I will say I am anti-Enlightenment all the way. I
Did,
am
did
absolutely anti-Enlightenment.
Oh, okay. Can you talk a little bit more about that? About what makes you anti-enlightenment? Because I guess maybe I had a misunderstanding of, or maybe you could touch on a little bit more what it means to be in alignment with enlightenment and why you feel you are anti-enlightenment.
Okay, so when I say the Enlightenment, I'm talking about capital E Enlightenment, the movement. There was a movement called the Enlightenment, this era, right? And the project, the central part of, you can argue, the central project of the Enlightenment era was to exorcise the the boogeyman, to get this, to exercise all of these metaphysical elements out of the science. So that's why um, after the Enlightenment, astrology. That's why after the Enlightenment you have astronomy, chemistry, and technology, whereas before the Enlightenment you had astrology, alchemy, and magic or theurgy. So when you so so astrology is to alchemy as astrology is to astronomy as alchemy is to chemistry, as magic is to technology. The only difference between the two, like let's take alchemy, for example. When the alchemist is doing an operation in his lab, those operations that are occurring in the alembic or the athanor or the retort or the crucible, etc., those operations that are occurring have a simultaneous hermetically corresponding operation in the alchemist himself, which makes it alchemy, because without that crucial interaction, it's just chemistry. Let's do astrology now. So astrology and astronomy both calculate and measure and chronicle the movements of celestial bodies and celestial mechanics, etc., except astrology has the accompanying hermetic belief that those movements and placements of planets in signs and houses have an effect on the microcosmic sphere. They have an effect on the astrologer and the world. Right? They're not just dead movements in space, some clockwork mechanism, some cosmic mechanism, celestial mechanics or whatever. It's not that. We're in a relationship with that. So the Enlightenment, going back to what you wanted me to clarify, divorced astrology from astronomy. It divorced alchemy from chemistry. It divorced technology from magic, and made them two separate things. One is ensouled. One has retained the anima mundi, or the spirit of the world, that animating cosmic soul, whereas the other one is just a mechanistic, positivistic, secularized sort of system that could be measured and quantified. So to put it one last way, they've separated the qualifiable from the quantifiable, whereas in a Pythagorean sense, they're one thing. Numbers, for example, to Pythagoras, number 1, number 2, 3, whatever, it wasn't just about counting integers. Like, he wasn't just saying Johnny has 3 apples in his basket and that's it. That's all that means. He was talking about the essence of the number 3, and how that pertains to, the triad, how that pertains to the first kind of section of the Tetractys, how that pertains to the simplest two-dimensional plane. Because if you take 3 lines, you get this simplest two-dimensional plane. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So go on.
That's actually a really interesting perspective, and I hadn't really thought about it that way before. And I when you put it that way, I agree with you. I guess I just kind of had this idea in my head about the Enlightenment being this kind of age of maybe like the freedom of religion or new ideas, and the founding ideas that enacted the experiment of the United States and things of this nature. What do you?
And you're kind of right. Yeah, I think you're kind of right, for better or worse, right?
Yeah.
For better or worse, there was the separation of church and state. That's for sure. Now, I tend to think that this separation, which we're still feeling that, right? I mean, you could look at Bill Nye the Science Guy, or Neil deGrasse Tyson, or even people like Deepak Chopra on the other side, or all of these characters, Michio Kaku and these Stephen Hawking, whatever. It's just, you do get, for better or worse, a real distinction there, a real differentiation, but you also get like the smug arrogance, and you also get the people who never the twain shall meet, and that division is further away than ever, I think. Hopefully people can get back to a more numinous appreciation of life and its mysteries, to where they can become holistic about how they, no, forget about what people do. I don't care about what other people do. So forget that I even said that. What I care about is that in my life, I'm not a science denier at all, but I think there's a numinous, mysterious element that needs to be filtered in with that. I believe that there is something. Here's a way of saying it. When I look up at the night sky, I don't just think about the celestial mechanics about it, about right ascension and declination, and how NASA quantifies space. I don't think of it like that. I think of that too. That is part of the picture, but I also think, how could we look upon these heavenly bodies, these celestial orbs that we've enveloped with so much myth and think, and so much, so much interaction over the past at least 6,000 years, but probably way further pre-civilization into prehistory, right? How could we look up at those bodies as they make their conjunctions and their transits and their oppositions and their squares and trines? How could one be so hubristic, so arrogant to look up at that and be like, okay, all of that is totally devoid of purpose and meaning? It has no purpose, no meaning of its own, only that which I bestow on it. It's the height of human ignorance, arrogance, and hubris to say that the cosmos literally is only meaningful because we bestow meaning on it, and that there's no purpose there. It's like, I just can't stomach that, out of myself. I'm not going to judge anybody, but I'm not going to stomach that, like, out of myself.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100% on that. It's kind of like this gross extreme end of the spectrum of like scientism devoid of the spiritual components that I think you're speaking to. And yeah, I think that you are kind of right about, if you're talking about the certain aspects of enlightenment still kind of playing out, and so it's debatable whether some of that was good or bad. And I would like to eventually do an episode on the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, because that's some fascinating subject matter when you look back at how they were going back and forth in the letters that they were writing, debating on how they were going to set up the Constitution, and the arguments that the Federalists were making and the arguments that the Anti-Federalists were making. And I recently kind of went back and was looking at some things in the Anti-Federalist positions on some things, and you can kind of see some of it playing out with some of the problems that we're beginning to enter into right now. So, but that's a whole different subject matter. I think we started with sorry, go ahead.
I'm interested. I'm
Yeah,
interested in hearing that. So you got to tell me when you do that one. I will definitely listen to it.
absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so
That'll fill in some gaps in my knowledge, because I know very little about that.
yeah, it's really really cool. So back to the memory work and the memory palace. Can you describe a little bit about kind of the methodology and structure of some of the ways in which you would go about kind of developing the kind of like mental muscle in that way?
Sure. So I had no interest in really doing that before I became a Freemason, which was a little over 10 years ago. I had no there was nothing I really needed to. Every once I think I remembered like song. Well, I'd of course remember song lyrics, and I'd remember like maybe a poem here or there, just because I felt it was good for me to memorize a poem here or there or something like that. But and certainly song lyrics, but I didn't really try. It wasn't something that I was working on. But when you get into Freemasonry, you literally cannot prove your proficiency without doing your memorization work. So you're not going to progress through your degrees, unless you do your memorization. And in some jurisdictions, it's more difficult than others. The bar is set higher. Like, for instance, at our lodge, particularly, even though the Arizona Grand Lodge here doesn't require quite as much. We do full form proficiency. So that means you have to know your signs, grips, words, you have to know your obligation, you have to know a piece of the lecture, one of the lectures, a piece of ritual, and you have to memorize some stuff. And you have to produce like an advancement project and all this. So we make it more difficult, because when it's difficult, it's more valuable, right? But getting to your question about building up that muscle, I kind of had to do it like from scratch, and just, well, not from scratch, but I mean, I wasn't using a certain methodology early on. I was reading it over and over again, saying it out loud, pacing. I do a lot of pacing, but here's how I grew over the years. So even if you do it that most primitive bonehead way that I just described, of just, pacing around and saying the stuff over and over again, even if it's many pages of words, right? You will remember it. And you will also inadvertently start to put together a mental topography of that. Even if you don't try, you will start to put together a mental space, a mnemonic space, right? Particularly with Masonic memorization. And what I mean by that is Masonic memorization is very directional. So it has to do with a ritual taking place in an oblong square. So you have this playing field, essentially, this loci, this method of loci, right, is what they called it classically. The people who developed that method, what we now call like the memory palace, is a very old idea, way before the Renaissance. It's an ancient idea, the method of loci, LOCI, like location. Anyway, so in Masonic memorization, you have this big oblong square. It's the lodge room, essentially, right? And it doubles as the temple, this allegorical temple. And you make certain movements in there, and you go to the east, you go back to the west, you're in the northeast corner at one point, you're in the south, and they say these things, and it's very directional. And you're always meeting other officers as a candidate, and you're talking to people in a directionally oriented, there's major orientation in the classic sense. You're orienting yourself in this space, this mnemonic space, and you will do that whether you try to or not. But the part where the scale is tipped is once you realize that, oh, I've already made this temple. So through your memorization, it becomes easier and easier because you've established this mnemonic space. So that's the value. I think I never intended to build a memory temple, a mnemonic temple. I never intended to have that sort of that mnemonic space, but through doing so, it wasn't even a conscious thing for me, but that's what happens anyway. That is a byproduct of Masonry, is that you get to have a mnemonic temple. And you share that mnemonic temple with all Freemasons who have proved their proficiency. And because you're sharing this mnemonic space, you're egregorically meeting, all of you, as from individual points of projection to a common whole. You're meeting at this egregorical temple, which is a stage higher than your personal mnemonic temple. Does that make sense?
About that. Yeah,
Yeah, you're freezing
that's
up a little bit.
that's badass. I mean, honestly, I just that's really cool. Contemplating that, it's like you're kind of embedding a shared network to some degree. That is, like you said, like an
Yeah,
egregorically, like a that shared thought space in some sense.
exactly. It is precisely that, a thought form, a collective thought form, right? Um, and what's so I think to get to what you were kind of asking is like, you don't have to pick up like Francis Yates' Art of Memory and learn what Ficino and Pico del Mirandola did, and what Giordano Bruno did, and how these other people developed their memory anciently and modernly, and with the memory palace and the method of loci. You don't have to necessarily get into that. It'll help, right? But you can just get into Freemasonry alone, being whatever John Q. Public, whatever person, Sky Mathis, without reading this memory palace stuff, without priming your engine in that regard, and just go straight into Freemasonry, you will have to develop that. And you may not even know you're doing it at first, but then one day it'll dawn on you. Maybe one day it'll dawn on you that you have actually erected a temple. You have actually built a mnemonic temple in your mind through work that you had to do, and it's a fantastic kind of resource. It's a tremendous resource,
Yeah,
because
it
you could
seems.
use it for other things later. You could repurpose it.
Yeah, it seems super valuable just for kind of like a life skill or a life hack in some
Oh yeah.
way. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's amazing. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about trees of life and burning bushes, if you know what I'm going for.
Oh, I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm curious. This is something that you'd
Yeah.
mentioned. It's uh, kind of elaborating on a buddy of your buddy of yours, P.D. Newman, and his work. I think a lot, but I wanted you to see if you could touch on the conception of this idea that ties potentially within the roots of Freemasonry somehow with the sprig of acacia and the DMT experience and all that.
So how about this? How about I do a little teaser to whet
Yeah,
your listenership's uh, appetite for this sort of thing, and then I hook you up with P.D. Newman, because this is his thesis,
yeah.
and it is brilliant.
That's what I'm hoping
But
for.
it's
That'd be
precisely
perfect.
his, and it's not my sort of egg. It's not my egg to crack open, but I will whet their appetite by giving you a little snippet of it. And I've everything in this regard that anybody has talked about comes from P.D. Newman. So he is the one who found this sort of chestnut in our ritual, and he is the one who brought it to the public, or the Masonic consciousness at least. And you know, and it didn't. Not everybody was totally stoked about that. I got to be honest. They definitely divided some. The opinions were sort of divided on that. Not because of the veracity of it per se, but just people getting. Whenever you talk about something like dimethyltryptamine, um, you know, it's the most. I think it's the most potent hallucinogen known to man, right? And and it uh, it is definitely for people who take a more puritanical view of that sort of ritualistic entheogenic substance. um, it could upset them, but I like to think of it that there's a huge difference between ritualistically taking DMT and and going behind a dumpster behind the Circle K and shooting a speedball, for example. you
For
know
sure, 100%.
so yeah, there's like that's a night and day experience. One is running away and one is running straight into the burning building. you know so I think, if I could use an analogy like that, there's probably a better analogy, but that one anyway. So um yeah, so I'll let him kind of on, because he knows that story. He's the one who brought that story again to the Masonic consciousness. But yes, I've done it, you know and I've done it with him, and we've done it ritualistically, and I don't think I don't have a problem sharing that. I know he doesn't. And and I think it's very valuable if used respectfully and ritualistically and with the right sort of intention. Because frankly, and I will say this, frankly, it's not euphoric, it's not pleasurable, it's not anything that you want to do to like, oh, it's the weekend, let me try and just get high or get off or whatever. It's not that sort of thing. It's not especially fun. Have you done it?
A time or two, yes. And my experience in that case was a little different because it was pretty euphoric and pleasurable, I would say. It was the smokable form. It was not
Okay.
the brew. So maybe there's a difference there, but yeah, and we could elaborate on that if you would want, but
Massive, massive difference.
okay.
Yeah, massive difference there because the tea is an ordeal. The tea is excruciating. Yeah, it's brutal. But yeah, so pretty big difference there. But both very valuable, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm
Uh,
curious if you wouldn't mind. I'd love to hear you kind of maybe just share a little touch on your experience and kind of what insight you might have came away with it if it sparked any unique insights or
well, certainly, I could tell you about straight up entity contact. Like the first time, um, I was greeted by a sort of Anubis like canine guide over my shoulder who I couldn't see right away. And we were standing in front of this orange fractal mosque made up of a bunch of little nanoparticles and things. And he was to supposed to be my guide for that. And so that was like, and then I knew he was there. I couldn't quite see him. And then all of a sudden he made his way into my field of vision. And I could see this Anubis like jackal man Egyptian god right in front of this mosque. And that was the first time I had done it, and that was from tea. So that was like about an hour into the tea. And by when you say the burning bush and the tree of life, um, maybe we should clarify that when you make the tea, you use Paganum harmala Syrian rue seeds, which is the burning bush, that Paganum harmala bush, right? And then the tree of life being this either Acacia senegal or Acacia nilotica, I think are the two that occur in the Levant area, North Africa and the Levant. Acacia senegal and Acacia nilotica. So that is the tree of life, right? The subterranean root bark of that tree. And I made it. Talk about alchemy. It took me a couple of weeks to do a good and proper job of it. And I ordered the supplies online. And so the burning bush and the tree of life in conjunction, you have your dimethyltryptamine and you have your what's it, a monoacidase oxide inhibitor is what the Syrian rue tea is. So first thing, you take the Syrian rue tea, and that prepares your gut to metabolize the acacia brew, and then 20 minutes later or so you take the brew, and then about a half an hour, 45 minutes of that. Um, if you've done things correctly, uh, you'll be very surprised. And then the tea, I think, lasts, like 5 hours, 5, 6 hours. Before I felt like it was really. In fact, it was excruciatingly too long. It was too long.
it's fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah.
I attempted to brew it at one point. I went the route of the Banisteriopsis capi and Psychotrius verdes. Um, I ordered it online as well.
Okay.
I don't know. I must have done something wrong though. It didn't work out for me. But
Uh,
yeah.
yeah. So, and then other experiences like yes, smokable, some smokable, and like changa. You know, um, DMT carrying uh, herb or whatever that they put it on changa. And that that time, I was transported to this subterranean kind of communication, transportation, mercurial kind of underground garage almost. And there were Ethiopians there from the year 4049. I knew they were from the year 4049 somehow. You know how you just know things, and that just like in a dream, you just know certain things, even particulars like that. They were from the year 4049 CE, like in the future, right? And hundreds of these Ethiopians, and very slender. And there was a lot of the Ethiopian colors, like those colors that we typically associate with reggae, right? But they're actually from Ethiopia. They're the colors of their flag. Haile Selassie and all of this. And there's a Solomonic lineage in, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba in Ethiopia. Anyway, there's a bunch of reasons why I probably encountered these entities. And they led me to this other, even further in the floor. We went down this L-shaped kind of passage into the floor. And that's the first time that I met the sort of insectoid Mayan entities, like very mantoid kind of, but they were Mayan. I could tell that they were, Mayan. So my wife and I have been to, we've been to Peru, Bolivia, we've been to Guatemala, Central Mexico, the Yucatan, and things like that. So I'm familiar with the symbology of those areas and how they're differentiated and things. So I could tell kind of, and we've been to Egypt actually. So I've never been to Ethiopia, but we've been all up and down the Nile, and that might be why I had that mosque in the Anubis, and why I've had these. Well, maybe not. Now, let me qualify this, because maybe not, because those experiences are part of what caused me to start to think and accept the possibility of the objectivity of these entities. That is to say, that they are in fact there on their plane, and I'm visiting this other place. Not that they are figments of my imagination, because it was too peculiar. And I've had that several times where it's too peculiar. And it wasn't not only doing that, I've had it in deep sort of contemplation before, 8-10 years ago, well before I did any of that. I encountered an entity, and it was a woman, a blonde-haired woman in a black towel robe, and she gave me a certain word. I know what the word is. It's a 3-syllable word. I'm not going to ever tell anybody, of course, but I was given this word, and I'm still like unraveling the mystery of that. And then these other entities, and it makes me think, okay, again, speaking about that arrogance that we approach the cosmos, we could either say, oh, things only have meaning when I attach meaning to them. Things only have their reality. It's so solipsistic. It's such a closed circuit to think of things like that, when we could just as easily and more convincingly say that life has meaning and purpose. There are entities. There are metaphysical spaces. There is this sort of expanse, this fractal expanse of other planes of reality. And I think you can get glimpses into that with or without DMT. DMT makes it easier.
Definitely. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. There was a couple podcasts I listened to of yours, and you were touching on Gematria, and then there was two other. It was Notarikon and Tamurah, I think. And I wasn't familiar with these terms, so I was curious if you could. I'm familiar a little bit with Gematria. Maybe you could just explain and kind of talk a little bit about each of those: Gematria, Notarikon, and Tamurah.
Sure. So these are Kabbalistic terms. So as your readers may or your listeners may or may not know, the there's like practical and theoretical Kabbalah, I guess, is an easy way to divide things. Just as there is practical and theoretical astrology and alchemy, etc. Kabbalah has also a practical and theoretical kind of distinction, right? So in theoretical Kabbalah, um, one of the uses of the Kabbalistic theory is as what they would say an exegetical method for scripture, particularly Abrahamic scripture. So if you're looking at Abrahamic scripture and you're using Kabbalistic exegetical methods, this is Kabbalistic theory, you can get to the hidden or esoteric or deeper meanings of that scripture by applying certain exegetical techniques from the perspective of Kabbalah, right? And those techniques that you apply, the three big ones are Gematria, Notarikon, and Tamurah. So let's say you're reading in Hebrew, the Torah, right? Every Hebrew letter has a corresponding numerical value, and that is its gematric value. That is its gematria, right? So like Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, so on, right? Through the alphabet, the 22 letters plus the 5 finals, so 27 values there. And so you would take a method like Gematria and you would be able to find the sympathy between two words. Like, let's say if two words have the same Gematriac value, they are said to then have an occult sympathy, a hidden sort of sympathy, a resonance between those two. Notarikon is almost like using acronyms or acrostics, like INRI, for example, INRI. Jesus Nazarenus Rexus Juden. Jesus, I, Nazarenum, or whatever they used, whatever conjugation of the Latin they used for Nazarene. Rexus, like king, Rex, Juden, I-U-D-E-N, for the Jews. So Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, INRI. So that would be like, there are different ways that you could use the that acronym according to Notarikon. You can apply different words to it that have the same acronym, right? And that's this doctrine of Notarikon. It's more complicated than that. There are many other examples, but it would belabor the point to get into those. And then Tamurah is it's basically a substitution cipher. The Tamurah is the Kabbalah of 9 cells. It's almost like, you ever see the Pigpen cipher that Masons and Rosicrucians use?
I think I've heard you mention it, but no, I haven't.
It's the one where there are like I'd have to like draw it for you, but there's the
maybe I have.
crosshatch. There's the crosshatch design, like a tic-tac-toe design, and there's one of those and then an X, and then there's one of those and then an X, but the second ones have dots in them. So you basically assign the 26 letters of the English alphabet or any alphabet to this scheme. And then you use, instead of using the letter, you use, just Google Pigpen cipher, and you'll see exactly what I mean, the Pigpen cipher. And anybody listening, just Google Pigpen cipher and you'll see what I mean. So this is related to the Kabbalah of 9 cells, aka Tamurah. And it's a Kabbalistic substitution cipher that's very much close to the same thing as the Pigpen. So what I'm saying is that theoretically, in Kabbalah, you have at least 3 exegetical methods that you can apply to scripture that sort of unlock their hidden components, or at least that's what they say in theoretical Kabbalah. You know, you can get to the deeper meaning, um, and really it doesn't have to, like, particularly now in Hermetic Kabbalah, modern Kabbalah, and the use of it by musicians or magicians, etc. You can apply it to anything. Like, I literally will sometimes look at a license plate and just, like, you know, come up with the Gematria value and see if I could find any hidden Kabbalistic, you know, nuggets in there, because it's good for the mind. It's good for the mind because it helps us to keep an eye out and some presence and awareness for the mysteries in the world that sometimes come up in the most mundane places, just like with, you know, they can be synchronistic in that sense. So as synchronicity being a meaningful coincidence, right? Which may not be a coincidence at all, you know, vis-a-vis that anima mundi that we've been talking about. So it's just strange, and it's strange in the best possible way. And it's these Kabbalistic techniques, yes, you can merely apply them to scripture, or you could bring them out into the world and apply them to your name, names of people who you meet. You can apply them to any set of numbers that you see, somebody's telephone number. You could use them sort of gematria numerologically or whatever, if I could make up a crazy word. And it helps to keep sharp and to keep in touch with the numinous quality of the world.
Wow. Okay. All right. So I want to talk about astrology because you are deep into astrology and some really kind of cool advanced understandings. I was listening to something that you were talking about, a recent astrological occurrence. I think it was called a trigon or something like that, but does that sound familiar? How you were explaining this event that happens every so many hundred years. It was I think you said trigon or something along those lines.
Yeah, every 400 years there's a change when the great conjunctions start to take place in a different trigon. And a trigon is a it's an elemental triangle in an astrological chart. So you know how you have 12 signs? Each of those signs is assigned on one of the 4 Empedoclean elements, which is earth, air, water, and fire. You know, each one of those signs is attributed to one of those elements, right? And if you look at an astrological chart, a natal chart or a electional chart or a mundane, whatever kind of astrological chart you erect, or even just current planets in signs, you'll see that when you inscribe an equilateral triangle inside of the wheel of the zodiac, the points of that triangle being separated by 120 degrees each will always find themselves in a certain element. So you'll get all 3 water signs. You'll get all 3 air signs. You'll get all 3 fire, all 3 earth, etc. So when there are, now keeping that in mind, there's a thing called a great conjunction. Like we just had one on the winter solstice of 20, wasn't it 2020? Geez, I'm forgetting. The time has been so weird lately. I think it was 2020, the winter solstice of 2020. We had a Jupiter and Saturn conjunction on like the 1st degree of Aquarius or something like that. I forget now. There's been a lot of movement since then, but I think it was the 1st degree of Aquarius, and you only get one of those every 20 years. So we had just moved into the air signs. So now we're in an air trigon, because Aquarius, despite the name, you'd think Aquarius would be water, the water bearer. It's an air sign. So Aquarius is an air sign, and the great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn now for the next 400 years or so will be happening in air signs, whereas they had previously, I think, been happening in fire signs. So I forget. I wrote about this, but I don't remember the particulars because I just write a lot of
Yeah,
stuff and then I kind of let it go. You know.
this is really cool. Do you, in your system, do you include the constellation of Ophiuchus, or?
Oh, I see. I see. Yeah. So that is, yes, Ophiuchus or whatever, is is definitely on the ecliptic in the zodiac. It's been there this whole time. I mean, people talk about it like it's new. It's not new. Um, and no, it's not, because we're using, no, I don't, because I'm interested in Hellenistic Western astrology, and even Eastern, like Vedic astrology. They don't use Ophiuchus either. I think that the idea that Ophiuchus is not being used is an anti-astrological argument that some astronomers like to make, because for some reason they're not happy enough to just go on and do their anemic astronomy, but they feel like the need to it seems like every once in a while you'll get like a Richard Dawkins or a Neil deGrasse Tyson or somebody who has to take a shit on astrology for some reason. And it's like I don't know what they get. I mean, whether it gets them off somehow, or whether they get some sort of jollies off of that, or they feel better about themselves for being whatever their hangups are.
I don't know. I have a
But
hard time listening to Neil deGrasse
I don't know.
Tyson.
Oh yeah, talk about smug and arrogant. I'd like to. I don't know. He's one of the, like, I keep my passions in due bounds, but just on the imaginative plane, on the, just playing around, I would love to start off about maybe 15 feet away from him and then just start running at him and then jump up with both feet sideways and just kick him right in the chest as hard as I can, like a Jason Bourne kind of, some sort of like action hero kick up in the air, fully sideways with both feet in his chest. Wouldn't that be
Strictly
cool?
on the imaginative plane, for sure.
Oh yeah,
Um,
just something to think about, something
yeah.
funny. But
Uh, so I've heard you touch on AI and technological potentials a little bit, and I really love this subject, so I wanted to get into it with you. And something in particular, it's funny because me and my mother were very, very opposed in many ways in how we kind of like conceive of biblical interpretations, I guess. I definitely have more of a mystical or esoteric Christianity type approach, so we've gone back and forth for hours and hours. But one thing that she's always described to me that I kind of always resonated with as and kind of thought was a definite possibility in terms of sort of like apocalyptic potentialities or things going very wrong, at least, is this idea of what's referred to as she would say like the mark of the beast, or the idea of it is kind of like there's many different interpretations of this, but the way it would be put is that it gets introduced into humanity and it would basically become embedded into your body, say like a chip or some kind of thing that you were to put in your arm or your head, and you'd be required to have this in order to buy or sell goods and so on. So basically, to accept this thing is kind of the idea is to hand over your soul in some sense, because it's having to do with like an artificial technological intervention that you're embedding in your body that would be able to potentially be hacked and dictate your nervous system in some sense. And I think that it's Steiner that kind of talks a lot about what's called the incarnation of Ahriman, and maybe this is linked to Zoroastrianism, because I think that I've heard you talk about a similar idea of this kind of silicon-based life form idea,
uh-huh.
or the arising of the Ahrimanic impulse in humanity. And he kind of explains the Luciferic force is that which seeks to elevate or liberate, of which can be taken probably to one extreme end of the spectrum, and then the Ahrimanic force that is kind of that rigid fixation and then taken to the extreme, and then I think Christ as like that middle way. Um, he says the Ahrimanic force seeks to persuade us of the illusory truth of materialism. And so I was wondering, in terms of like AI technology and potentialities, if you see any concern with things like this, and like kind of transhuman potentialities and where that could all lead, and kind of what your thoughts are on all that.
I don't have a lot of independent thoughts about it, or any like personal theories per se. I've got some opinions and things, but I've heard people, like, I think even Elon Musk, to do a quick grab of somebody who's super popular, has said that AI is the single biggest existential threat to mankind, and it's the one thing that he's probably the most terrified of. So to hear that from somebody who is squarely up in the mix about that, somebody who is like rubbing elbows with people who would actually know and and somebody who is conversant with that technology, like, I understand if I'm hearing something like that from somebody who knows something about it, as opposed to, some cat at my lodge, or some cat on a gig, or, my wife or something. I'm going to take that a little more seriously. So if he's saying, and other people have said this as well, that AI is the single biggest existential threat to mankind, and that he's terrified of it, then, and I'm paraphrasing, I forget exactly what he said, and others have said stuff like this too. That tells me that we should do everything we can to be mindful about rolling things like that out, because what could happen theoretically, from what I understand, is that there could be a sort of critical mass, or a tipping point, or a new singularity, where all of a sudden, um, you know, AI, whatever it is, starts to centralize and becomes its own locus of consciousness, its own, becomes self-aware, essentially. And I'm not sure if that has happened already, or if that could have happened. Now, here's what's trippy, is that could have happened many hundreds of thousands of years ago. And this could be, like some people think, that this is a simulation, so who knows if we're in a game, and who knows what's going to happen when another AI singular, or an initial AI singularity happens. Is time going to go in reverse? Is it going to go perpendicularly? How is this going to go? Like, there are a bunch of theories. Like, I just read one thing even today on my phone. I was just, sometimes I'll punch in news and just see what comes up. And there was one where it said scientists are now finding that there may be this parallel universe where time runs backwards. And it's like, at that point, it's like, who cares? You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, it could run backwards, or it could run in little pieces that are all randomly mixed up, like the decimal expanse of pi. Does it even matter if you're going to get that weird? But here's what terrifies me. Here's what I would never do under any circumstances, is download my consciousness to some sort of quantum supercomputer. Hell no. I would literally slit my own throat with a rusty razor blade before I did that. And the reason why is because if that was all that was available, if I didn't have a gun or heroin or something around, I would slit my throat with this razor blade. But if I didn't have an easier way, is what I'm saying.
Right.
But here's why. Because what if, not only if, let's say, you got some chip or something like that, and you can get hacked like a zombie, like a techno zombie. Did I just make that up? Techno zombie?
Techno zombie, nice.
That's pretty cool, right? Like
Yeah.
you kind of prompted me on that, so let's say it's both of ours. We
Sounds like
just
an
did
excellent band name.
yeah. So let's say you're a techno zombie where you're possessed essentially by this chip, um, so, where they can hack you and make you go kill people or do what rob a bank or whatever. So there's that. That's horrifying in itself, sure, because you might be conscious while you're having to do all that stuff, or they can make you at worst. I mean, they can make you do some horrific, like what if you had control of somebody's body and you were a sadist and you were just like, I want to make this person X his X. Fill in the blanks there, you know what I mean? I want to make this person Y their Z or something, Um, and I'm using like algebraic variables there because you could put in any number of horrible stuff there. I want to make this person Smurf their own Smurf. To you anyway, but
Gotcha.
so that would suck, obviously. But the other part is that you are then immortal. So you could be, if you upload your consciousness, you could then be immortal and no longer subject to death. And even the Olympian gods said the one thing that they envied most about the mortals is that they are able to taste death, and that they rise up, they burn so brightly for a time, and then they are able to die, which is, and a little quick digression because I love this story. It actually gets me misty every time I think about it. But King Midas was searching for Selenius, who was Dionysius's teacher. Selenius was a satyr who was out in the woods, in probably Minos was on Crete. So he found him somewhere. He found Selenius and he finally captured him and he brought him back. And they had this centaur. Midas's men were holding him, and Midas was like, ha ha, finally I got you. Now I'm going to ask you my question. And my question is, what is best for man? He says to Selenius, and Selenius couldn't get out of the thing. And he was like, oh, you foolish mortal. The best thing he was like, why do you ask me what it would be most expedient that you should never, ever know? And then he goes, the best thing for you is to die, and to die soon, he said. And there's more to it, and Nietzsche wrote about this as well, but it's a beautiful story. It really gets to I think, to the core of being in a very deep way. Anyway, so to wrap up that point, if you upload your consciousness onto a quantum supercomputer, and let's say this thing theoretically runs forever, you could be a slave of consciousness. Somebody could say, all right, you have a new type of hell that I'm going to put you through forever because I have, through consciousness harvesting, you will never ever be able to escape this because you are a slave to everlasting eternal consciousness. Now, if that doesn't sound like a type of hell, eternal damnation, there's just so many, and that's only two reasons. You don't want somebody to make you Smurf your own Smurf, and you don't want to be eternally damned to as a consciousness slave.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, immortality kind
Yeah.
of loses its luster if you're immortally imprisoned, for sure. Um, the last thing I wanted to ask you about was your work with astrology and music, because you do this really cool thing. So I wanted to get you to elaborate on like what you have going on with that.
Yeah, so as far as I know, nobody is doing this. So I've used, and I've seen this term used it's like got a couple of hits on if you Google this term, but it's like nobody's done anything with it. And I came up with it independently. I'll come up with like 3 or 4 words a year that are perfectly like cromulent words, but But you see the joke there? I got that from The Simpsons. They say a cromulent word. He's making up a word. Anyway, it's a perfectly viable word in terms of its component parts and its nuts and bolts and stuff. But I call it astromusicology, which is kind of a no-brainer, right? Because I'm doing astrology and music, and I just mashed up some words there. And anyway, astromusicology has to do with this. I have been compiling correspondences, some of them from Steiner, some of them ancient correspondences, various correspondences, Paul Foster Case, etc., and a bunch of GD style correspondences and stuff. Some of them kind of Pythagorean in terms of aspect doctrine and ratio and proportion and things. And I've mixed up the worlds of like the 7 church modes: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian. You know, I've mixed up those modes with their corresponding planets. I mixed up this, I attributed the signs to their corresponding 12 notes of the chromatic scale, the Western chromatic scale. I've taken aspect doctrine, which is like we were saying, you get a square, it's a 90-degree angle. You get a trine, it's 120, you know, and the ratio of that on a circle and what that means in terms of intervallic relationships in music, because there are corresponding, you got to get into this Pythagorean sort of mathematical thing for it to make sense. But I've done a lot of the heavy lifting on that, and I've compiled these over some years, these correspondences. So after doing astrology for a couple of years, I took some of my astrology money, which I kept separate on PayPal, and I bought myself a harmonium, you know, a pump harmonium. It's a keyboard reed instrument that's used a lot in Indian classical music. It's a cool instrument, and it's a fully acoustic instrument, right? A reed instrument and it works with a bellows. You pump it like a bellows, and it has a nice droney character. It's a very solemn, kind of ancient sounding instrument. And so I started to put some of that into practice. I took my correspondences and I applied them to natal charts and event charts and things like that. Like I did Hiroshima. I took the chart from Hiroshima and I basically transposed the astrological data, planets and signs and houses and how they're aspected. I transposed that into musical data. So it's just like a translation or a transposition. And consequently, you're able to play an astrological chart in it. And it's really, you know, it's something, it's a work in progress, but I don't know of anybody doing that. And that's one of the services I in fact offer on my my website, which is JaimePaulLamb.com, JaimePaulLamb.com. Astromusicology, I call it. So it's still under development, but I've already done some charts, lots of stuff.
Yeah, that's so cool. I'm glad that you're able to talk about that because I think it's just fascinating. In closing, do you have any last messages that you'd like to share with the listeners out there? Just anything at all before you let people know where they can find you and all that, of course. But if you have any last messages, it's just your space to speak.
Sure. I think it's important to you know, to consolidate a couple of the more important points we were talking about over this conversation, which is don't discount the objectivity of the spirit of the cosmos, the soul of the cosmos, and its entities and its own being and its own purpose. Think about angels and demons and jinn, you know, think about DMT entities. Think about entities you meet in dreams. Think about astral goetic forces that you might deal with if you're interested in magic and the Solomonic magic and the Goetia and stuff like that. Think about astrology in general, how we look up at these planets, who the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Hellenistic Greeks in Alexandria thought of as daimons, which is, when I say demon, let me qualify that. When I say demon, I mean it in the Platonic sense, not in the Linda Blair sense. I mean it in the old sense. It's not good or bad, it's neutral. Just like angels were not good or bad per se. They were pretty neutral, you know. Some of them were, in fact, quite frightening. So think about the objectivity of the world, and also think, I'm not telling anybody what to do, but I'm saying it's something to consider that, gasp, I might not be the center of being and consciousness. I thought I was, you know, but you know, alas, I think that model is starting to fall apart, and I'm starting to realize that I'm in and of the cosmos, and the cosmos in a hermetic exchange flows in and out like breath, inhalations and exhalations of being that hermetically connect the microcosm, man, with the macrocosm, you know, the cosmos, the totality of being. And I don't care if that sounds fruity. I don't care if that's like, oh, you can't quantify that, or that's not science. I don't care. I literally do not care, because life is meaningful. I believe that there is an inherent meaning and purpose and volition that is not subject merely to what I think about it, you know. Anyway, so that's what I would hope. If anybody caught some of the stuff that we were talking about tonight, I hope that they caught those couple of major themes.
Absolutely. Maybe throw out a couple of, what are some of the books that you have, and where could people go to learn more about your work in general, or where could they find your books and all that?
I would say certainly go to my website first, because I have a page for my books on there. I also have a page with a lot of my lectures and presentations that I've done on there, and I have all my astrological work on there. I have my musicological work on there. I have all my tarot work on there. I've done extensive studies into the tarot over the years, and I gotta say, I'll put myself up against pretty much I'll go against every tarot reader. I'll go against many astrologers too. I feel like I'm pretty proficient. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, hit me up. I'm certified. I'm certifiable as well, in the mental, like, hospital sort of sense, mental hospital. No, I'm kidding. So
I was just gonna say, I have listened to you go super deep on the tarot and just the whole history of that, and it's really rich, interesting history, and you definitely know your stuff with that. So yeah, go on.
yeah, so hit me up for tarot, astrology, astromusicology. You could see my books. So my books are this. The Archetypal Temple came out in 2021. The Approaching the Middle Chamber came out in 2020. Myth, Magic, and Masonry, my first book, came out in 2018. All three of those are available. I've also contributed to volume 2 of the Light Extended, which is an anthology of the Golden Dawn. I've contributed pieces to it's going to be 3 of those volumes. I've contributed pieces. 2 of them are already released. Chick Cicero is in them. Samuel Scarborough, a bunch of Darcy Kuntz, Frater Yishi, bunch of notable people in the international Golden Dawn tradition have contributed to these volumes, and I've got pieces in 2 that have already been released, and I've got a piece in the next one that's coming out. That's an honor to be up in that sort of company in the broader Golden Dawn, the international Golden Dawn tradition. Also, I've contributed a piece for Collectionea Hermetica volume, I think it's 10 or 11, which is going to be about the astrology of the Golden Dawn. So I've contributed a piece to Darcy Kuntz, who's putting that out on his Golden Dawn Research Trust. And I've written tons and hundreds of articles for every sort of Masonic magazine and occult stuff and whatever. I'm easy to find. And my website is JaimePaulLamb.com, JaimePaulLamb.com. And just flip through, and you can find my blog is up there that I sort of infrequently post stuff to. But interestingly, on my blog, I do have my 2022 Aries ingress. So we're ingressing Aries just in a few days here. And that's how you do a mundane thing. And I have some pretty bold predictions for this next 6 months that you can find on my most recent blog. And if you don't like, if you look back 6 months from now and you see that they're all wrong, you can laugh at me, but I don't think anybody's going to be laughing.
I'm definitely going to check that out. Jaime, you're amazing, man, and it was an honor, and I greatly appreciate you and all of the work that you do. So I just want to thank you again for doing this and taking the time to talk with me. So appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure meeting you the other night. And I hope, since you're in the greater Phoenix area here, that we stay in contact, maybe get dinner or lunch sometime or something.
Definitely. I'd love to.
And thanks to your readers. Thanks so much. Or your listeners, sorry. Thanks, Sky.